Are you worried about being hassled by the man, arrested, pulled over, or as my grandmother called it, being yanked out of your house by the fuzz? That was weird. But in her defense, she had glaucoma and she'd been hitting her medication kind of hard that day. What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the world according to Briggs. Today we're ranking the states by how many cops, police, fuzz, whatever you want to call them, each state has per every 100,000 residents. I'll also give you the total number that they have. I got an email from a guy that wanted to know what state or city he had the best chance of not getting pulled over or arrested. There's really no way of knowing that. It's kind of up to you. Are you in a lowered Subaru with tinted windows, speeding, with expired tags, and a bumper sticker that refers to something about defunding the police? Of course, you're going to get pulled over before the dude in a Prius that's got a tie on. It's just how the world works. This video is really interesting. I was surprised by the difference between number 50 and number 1. Today's list will show you how many law enforcement employees a state has. I say law enforcement employees because this includes supervisor, detectives, crime scene investigators, etc., not just patrolmen. All right, let's take a look. Number 50, Utah. Utah's not known for having any big crime problems. It's actually really hard to find places that have a bunch of crime in Utah. It's a pretty safe state. Actually, it's considered one of the safest states, so they don't really have a lot of need for police officers. This shows because they have less than 10,000 law enforcement employees throughout the whole state. They have 9,867. That breaks down to 298 per every 100,000 residents. That's not a lot. Number 49, Oregon. Yeah, outside of Portland and maybe Salem, there's really not a lot of crime going on in Oregon. I know you see all the press and all the riots and all that. That's just in Portland for the most part. Yeah, it does trickle down to Salem and Eugene a little bit, but the rest of the state is pretty mellow. They have 13,007 law enforcement employees. That breaks down to 303 for every 100,000 residents. 48, Washington. A lot like Oregon, you've got a lot of areas that are really just kind of sparsely populated and not a lot of crime going on. Sure, you have Seattle, which has a homeless problem and a bunch of other problems, and there's some crime going on there. That goes down to Tacoma and a couple other places, but really it's a pretty safe state. They have 24,677 law enforcement employees, breaking down to 316 for every 100,000 residents. 47, Minnesota. Minnesota, again, like the other two, Minneapolis has turned into a nightmare these days, but the rest of the state is very rural and very calm. There's not a lot of things going on there. And right now they're in the middle of an FBI probe, so they might be losing some of their law enforcement employees. Who knows? Minnesota only has 18,208 law enforcement employees, breaking that down to 319 for every 100,000 residents. Vermont. Do they have crime in Vermont? I mean, someone might steal your syrup. That's about it. It's not like they got a big problem with Canadians coming across the border. Their biggest city is Burlington, and there's not a lot that goes on there, crime or pretty much anything. So that means they don't need a lot of police. The entire state only has 2,012 law enforcement employees, giving them 322 for every 100,000 residents. And I think that's overkill for this state. 45, Iowa. Iowa's, they never had crime. In the last couple of years, some of their cities have started to show some promise when it comes to crime. They're kind of getting some crime these days. So they have a few more police than they did maybe 10 years ago to kind of deal with that crime, but they're not terrible. They have 10,287 law enforcement employees in the entire state. That means there's 324 for every 100,000 residents. 44, Michigan. I am shocked Michigan is this low on the totem pole. I mean, come on. Michigan's got Detroit and Flint, two of the worst cities in the country right now. The entire state has a lot, but when you break it down per every 100,000, they don't have that much. They have 36,286 law enforcement employees, and that breaks down to 363 for every 100,000 residents. That's not a lot for this state, especially with the problems they have. 43. Idaho. How Idaho is right next to Michigan, I have no idea. I mean, Idaho's not really known for crime. They have 6,863 law enforcement employees. That doesn't sound like a lot, but they don't have a lot of people living in this state. It breaks down to 368 for every 100,000 residents. All right, buckle up. This one's going to blow you away. 42, California. How did California get here? Again, they've got all kinds of problems like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Fresno, Modesto, Stockton, and they're number 42 on this list. That's crazy, but they have a whole bunch of people So that's why their per 100,000 residents isn't that big. They have a ton of cops, though. They have 148,180 law enforcement employees, but it only breaks down to 374 for every 100,000 residents because they have so many people living in the state. They probably need a lot more. 41, Ohio. Again, how are they so low? Ohio's got Cleveland, Ohio's got Dayton, Cincinnati, and Toledo. How are they at 41? Ohio has 45,284 law enforcement employees, breaking that down to 386 per 100,000 residents. 40, Indiana. Again, this one's a little bit of a shocker that they're this low on the list. Indiana has places like Gary, Indiana, Indianapolis, Muncie, and South Bend. These are not the best places to live in the country, and they all got a good amount of crime. But Indiana's ranked 40th when it comes to law enforcement employees. They have 26,320 law enforcement employees, breaking that down to, just like Ohio, 386 for every 100,000 residents. It's not a lot. Number 39, Nevada. Now, this one kind of makes sense at their placement. I mean, the Las Vegas metro area can be a nightmare in some areas. It's not terrible, but it's not the best. Then you get down to Laughlin. That's, it's not terrible. Carson City and Reno, again, not terrible. So they don't have a ton of crime, so it makes sense they don't have a ton of police officers. The rest of the state, if you don't know, is just little small towns along the highway and desert. They have 12,423 law enforcement employees, and that breaks down to 389 for every 100,000 residents. 38, Maine. Yeah, can't believe Maine isn't like the very bottom. They don't have any crime, but they also don't have a lot of people, so this one kind of is weird. Maine only has 5,367 law enforcement employees, and that breaks down to 396 for every 100,000 residents. I'm surprised they have that many, to tell you the truth. 37, Kentucky. Kentucky's a weird state. They got Lexington, they got Louisville, a couple other small cities, but it's mostly rural. They did get hit pretty hard with the whole opioid epidemic, but that's kind of mellowed out. They don't have many jobs. They got a lot of poverty, so they got some crime. I'm shocked they're right here at number 37. I think they should have more police, might fix some of their problems, but they got a lot of poverty, which usually brings a lot of crime. Kentucky has 17,885 law enforcement employees, and that gets you at 399 for every 100,000 residents. 36, Alabama. Alabama's got some problems. Those problems are Fairfield, Anniston, and Birmingham. Those places have some serious violent crime issues that need to be addressed. They needed to be addressed a long time ago. But the entire state has 19,943 law enforcement employees, and that gives you 404 for every 100,000 residents. Rhode Island. Rhode Island has hardly anyone living there because it's a very small state, as we all know. I mean, the state's nickname is Little Rhodey. They only have 4,296 law enforcement employees, and that is 404 for every 100,000 residents. 34, Nebraska. Nebraska, again, doesn't have a lot of crime. Most of their crime involves livestock. For that reason, they only have 7,905 law enforcement employees. Now, keep in mind, most of this state is rural. I mean, like 80% of it is just kind of farmland. So there's not a lot of need for police officers, but they still have 404 for every 100,000 residents. 33, New Hampshire. The Granite State doesn't have a lot of people or a lot of crime, so they don't really need a lot of police officers. Like Vermont, they don't have big cities with big crime. One guy described New Hampshire and Vermont, saying the only difference between the two of them is New Hampshire's closer to Maine. Everything else is the same. New Hampshire has 5,595 law enforcement employees, giving them 407 for every 100,000 residents. 32, Oklahoma. Oklahoma, yeah, mostly rural. Sure, they got Tulsa, they got Oklahoma City, but really, it's just a bunch of small towns. They don't have a lot of crime outside of their big cities. But they still have 16,409 law enforcement employees, giving them 411 for every 100,000 residents. 31, Connecticut. Connecticut needs more law enforcement. They got some pretty crappy cities that have a lot of crime. Again, like I said in my last video, and like I say about every video, it's a weird state. They've got some really rundown cities and small towns, and then they have some of the nicest ones in the country. It's really strange. There's not a lot of in between. Connecticut has 14,688 law enforcement employees, giving them 413 for every 100,000 residents. And I promise you, most of the crime in this state is coming from Hartford. Number 30, Wisconsin. Outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin doesn't have hardly any crime. Got a few places and a few other cities that might have a little bit, but nothing compared to the rest of the country. It's a very safe state. I'm surprised they're at 30, because even, half of Milwaukee's nice and half it's not. But they have 24,484 law enforcement employees, giving them 418 for every 100,000 residents. 29. South Carolina. South Carolina needs more police officers. Charleston, Myrtle Beach, they're really nice. Columbia's really nice in some areas, but a lot of their small towns are pretty nasty, and they probably need some more police in those smaller towns. The entire state has 22,355 law enforcement employees, giving them 423 for every 100,000 residents. 28. Florida. I'm surprised Florida's this early in the list. They have a lot of bad stuff going on in the Miami metro area, the Jacksonville metro area, and a few other places around the state that probably need a lot more police officers. Florida only has 93,089 law enforcement employees, giving them 424 for every 100,000 residents. 27. North Dakota. North Dakota had a jump in crime about the same time they had a jump in oil production. Yeah, as soon as all that oil came in, they started having drug problems and all kinds of other problems. Well, as the oil and gas industry kind of slowed down, a lot of their crimes went away. They don't have that many police still. The entire state only has 3,269 law enforcement employees. That's really not a lot for an entire state. But they have so few people, they have 424 for every 100,000 residents. 26. Colorado. Colorado has places like Denver, Durango, Pueblo, and Grand Junction that all have, the good amount of crime. Not terrible, but they got some crime and they need some police officers. The rest of the state is pretty laid back, and the people aren't terrible to each other, so there isn't a big need for a lot of police officers. So this one kind of makes sense. They're middle of the road. They have 25,330 law enforcement employees in the entire state, giving them 429 for every 100,000 residents. 25. South Dakota. South Dakota, as more people move in there, they're probably going to need more police officers. They don't have a lot right now. The state doesn't have that many people. It's very rural. They have 3,880 law enforcement employees, giving them 432 for every 100,000 residents. 24. North Carolina. North Carolina's been gaining popularity over the last decade, I'd say. And with that, it's bringing in a little more crime than they had a decade ago. Well, all states are like that, but they're, going a little faster than other states. The entire state has 46,425 law enforcement employees, giving them 433 for every 100,000 residents. 23. Missouri. If they could get St. Louis out of their state, they'd probably only need half the officers they have right now. St. Louis is a nightmare in a lot of sections of that state, and that means they need a lot of police officers. Kansas City's not the greatest place either, but the rest of the state's kind of rural and kind of nice small towns. They have a few other cities dotted here or there that have a good amount of police officers, but Missouri only has 27,206 law enforcement officers, giving them 441 for every 100,000 residents. 22. Montana. I'm shocked they have police officers at all because everyone in the entire state is packing. And, whether you're a gun advocate or not, when there's a serious chance of you being shot for doing stupid stuff by the average citizen at Walmart, you tend not to do stupid stuff at Walmart. That being said, they only have 4,861 law enforcement employees, giving them 448 for every 100,000 residents. They're kind of high up on the list because they don't have a lot of people. 21. Massachusetts. I think it's strange that Massachusetts and Montana are right next to each other. They're totally different state. Massachusetts has cities like Springfield, Fall River, Brockton, Webster, Pittsville. These are all places that have a good amount of violent crime and crime in general, so they need some police officers. It's kind of a small state, but those cities, they get kind of bad sometimes. Boston too, but Boston's also a really nice city. They just have some areas. The entire state of Massachusetts has 31,057 law enforcement employees, giving them 449 for every 100,000 residents. 20. Kansas. Kansas has Kansas City, which is obviously right next to Kansas City, Missouri, but the Kansas side is a little safer. It's not terrible. They only have Wichita and Topeka. After that, they have a bunch of small towns with not a lot going on. I mean, there was a time Dodge City was a nightmare, but that was the 1800s. Now it's not that bad. So they don't need a lot of law enforcement employees, but they still do. Kansas has 13,138 law enforcement employees, giving them 450 per every 100,000 residents. And when you look at the stats, maybe because they have so many police officers, they have so little crime. The state doesn't have a lot of crime. 19, Tennessee. If you ever go to Memphis, you're going to think no matter what number I give you, you're going to think it's far too low when it comes to law enforcement employees in this state. Memphis is really bad. The rest of the state, some cities have its problems. Knoxville does, Nashville. But really, it's just Memphis that brings most of this state down. They probably have most of their police officers there. Tennessee has 31,332 law enforcement employees, giving them 451 for every 100,000 residents. 18, Wyoming. The only reason Wyoming's here is because they don't have a lot of people. And they just have some police officers, not a ton, but when you have so few people, the averages, you get the idea. Wyoming only has 2,673 law enforcement employees, giving them 460 for every 100,000 residents. Starting to get a lot for every 100,000 residents here. 17, Arkansas. This is a state that needs a lot more police officers. Their rural areas and their small towns, in some cases, can be a pretty good nightmare. You also have Little Rock and Pine Bluff. Pine Bluff is considered one of the most violent cities in the country, and it's really not that big. It's just dangerous. Got a little better maybe in the last 2 years, but it still sucks. Arkansas has 14,089 law enforcement employees. My opinion, I think they need about 5,000 more, and you could distribute them evenly between Little Rock and Pine Bluff, and you'd probably be pretty good. But right now they have 464 for every 100,000 residents. 16, Arizona. Arizona, again, like Montana, almost everyone there is packing, so they don't have a lot of crime, but they still have a good number of police officers. That's because you got big cities like Phoenix, Tucson, Yuma. It's really not a big city, but, Flagstaff's also good size. But the Phoenix area and the Tucson area, they're really the only place you're going to need a lot of police officers, and the entire state has 35,327, giving them 469 for every 100,000 residents. 15, Texas. Texas is big and has a lot of big cities. Really, they don't have as big a problem as, I'd say if you compared it to other states as big with as big as cities, they really don't have as much a crime problem. And part of that probably has to do with how many police officers they have. They have 139,673 law enforcement employees, giving them 469 for every 100,000 residents. 14, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania doesn't have a lot of crime throughout most of the state. They have the Pittsburgh metro area and they have the Philadelphia metro area, which, they've got some pretty bad spots there, especially Philadelphia. Maybe Scranton too, but the rest of the state is rural and beautiful and nice small towns with very little crime, so they don't need a lot of police officers. They still got a good amount. Pennsylvania has 60,448 law enforcement employees, and that gives them 472 for every 100,000 residents. 13, Illinois. Illinois has Chicago, so they have a lot of police officers. And if you know anything about the crime going on in Chicago, they don't have enough police officers. They have some other places in the state that, have some crime, but Chicago is the cherry on top of the crime milkshake. And that's part of the reason so many people are leaving Illinois. They're fleeing Chicago because of the crime. Illinois has 59,921 law enforcement employees. Doesn't sound like a lot, but I guarantee half of them are in Chicago. That gives them 476 for every 100,000 residents. Number 12, Hawaii. Hawaii, it's not really known for its crime. They do have some crime, but it's not really a big problem there. They don't need a lot of police officers, but it's such a small state, the number that they have for every 100,000 is kind of big. Hawaii only has 6,809 law enforcement employees, giving them 484 for every 100,000 residents. 11, Georgia. Georgia has some places that have some serious crime, like Albany and parts of Atlanta. The rest of the state is kind of rural. They got some pretty rundown small towns that have some crime, so it makes sense they have a lot of police officers. Compared to places like New York and California and Texas, they don't have nearly enough. But they still have 52,672 law enforcement employees, giving them 486 for every 100,000 residents. Number 10, Mississippi. Mississippi doesn't have a lot of crime outside of Jackson. Jackson is a hellhole that needs to be mowed over and started fresh again. Actually, if this state took all their law enforcement and pretty much put 80% of them in Jackson, I imagine they might be able to fix that city in maybe a year or so. I don't know. Mississippi has 15,243 law enforcement employees, giving them 513 for every 100,000 residents. 9, New Mexico. New Mexico has a lot of crime. They've got a lot of rundown smaller cities and a lot of small towns that just suck too. I was reading an article for research I did on this other video about them 2 years ago, and they were talking about they had such budget problems they were trying to balance, they've got rising crime, but they still had to unload a bunch of police officers because they couldn't afford it anymore. They used to do this thing where, I forget the numbers and I'd have to find the article again, but they used to raid like 50 drug houses a month in the Albuquerque metro area. And because of budget cuts, they were down to like raiding 6. So it was bad. Their budget problems and all that really screwed things up, but they still have a good amount of police officers. They have 11,096, and that gives them 527 for every 100,000 residents, and they need more. Number 8, Delaware. Does anything really go on in Delaware? This is a relatively safe state outside of Wilmington. Wilmington, Delaware is a nightmare. The rest of the state is pretty decent, but they only have 5,261 law enforcement employees, giving them 531 for every 100,000 residents. They don't have a lot of people. It's a small state, so that's why it's that way. Number 7, West Virginia. West Virginia kind of shocked me that it's this high up on the list. Outside of Charleston, Huntington, and Morgantown, most of the state is just small towns and rural. But the state got wrecked with the opioid epidemic years ago, and they have so many people out of work because of the coal industry, and they've got a lot of crime. They don't have a lot of people, but they still have a lot of crime, so that gets them at this position, number 7. They only have 9,445 law enforcement employees, but they have 534 for every 100,000 residents. And that's just because of the crime they've seen the last decade or so. Number 6, New Jersey. This is a state in desperate need of more law enforcement. They don't have a lot. It's not an extremely large state, but they still have some places that really need more police officers. They have cities like Teterboro, Trenton, Asbury Park, Salem, and of course everyone's favorite, Camden. Yeah, they need more police officers. But the entire state only has 48,599 law enforcement employees, giving them 547 for every 100,000 residents. Number 5, Alaska. The only reason they're here is because nobody lives in Alaska. They don't have a lot of police officers or law enforcement employees, but they're per every 100,000 residents kind of high. Alaska only has 4,214 law enforcement officers. That's not a lot, but they're at 581 for every 100,000 residents. Number 4, Virginia. Virginia's a pretty safe state and they have a lot of police officers for the amount of people they have. They've got some areas, sure, just like every state, but in general, the state's pretty safe. Virginia has 51,306 law enforcement employees, giving them 596 for every 100,000 residents. Number 3, Louisiana. Louisiana has some really dangerous places. Baton Rouge, most of New Orleans, and the most dangerous place in any state, like a mile radius around any place that sells waffles. I don't know what it is about the South, but anytime you're reading something about some crime or some shooting, they had just left a waffle place. I don't know what it's all about. Number 2, Maryland. Yeah, who saw this one coming? You know who saw this one coming? Anybody that realizes Baltimore is in Maryland. Maryland's not a big state, but they have Baltimore, and Baltimore is ugly in a lot of places. Crime stats in Baltimore are crazy bad, so it makes sense they have a lot of police officers. Maryland has 38,717 law enforcement employees, giving them 638 for every 100,000 residents. And before we get to number 1, don't forget we got another channel called On This Day. There's a link down below. We'd love it if you checked it out. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, New York State. Yes, New York State, it needs police officers. I mean, you got Buffalo, you got New York City, you got my cousin Liz's house around happy hour. They need a lot of police. New York has 125,920 law enforcement employees, giving them 652 for every 100,000 residents. A lot of police officers. All right, that's today's list. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Go out, have a great day, and be nice to each other. Don't get in trouble.